Uh, and we'll be talking about the current state of education and the future of EdTech. And so just introduce myself. I'm Andrew Hutton, Human Ventures Head of Business Design. And if you don't know us, Human Ventures is a startup studio and venture funds. And we operate as a business creation platform, launching new businesses through our studio and powered by corporate innovation partners in our venture funds. And so I'm as excited as anyone to hear what Megan has to say about education and what the future holds for us. Let me spend a second and introduce Megan. Megan was the founder of one of Human's first portfolio companies, Clark, which is an EdTech company that supports educators and tutors by providing a marketplace of economic opportunities. Clark was recently acquired by Noodle, and so now Megan is an entrepreneur in residence at Kaplan Test Prep, working to build new products at the intersection of education and the future of work. And so thank you, Megan, for joining us. This is
thanks for having me.
A fun chat. Excited to get some ideas on the table here. So just so everyone has a little setup, we're going to run this like an Ask Me Anything, an AMA, meaning we've already gotten a lot of audience submitted questions that I've compiled into a nice, neat list. So I'll sort of lead the question asking. But if you have an extra question that didn't get asked or a follow-up or something that you weren't able to get in, do submit it in the chat, and we'd love to make this as interactive as possible. So please go ahead on that front. And yeah, without any further ado, I'll kick it off. And really, maybe just Megan, what if we start off and ask a question? Do you mind sharing with the group a little bit of why, when we were chatting just last week, you were so interested in having an AMA and talking about the future of EdTech, and maybe even expand a little bit of where you're coming from and what you're seeing, and maybe just kick it off with some thoughts that you're having.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, definitely thank you for having me. And it feels fun to come back to a Human Ventures event now that I've flown from the nest. But Andrew and I were talking on the phone last week, talking about a lot of different things in a post-COVID world. And one of the things I mentioned to him is just how many text messages I had received over the last couple of weeks from friends, from parents, from VCs, asking me questions about education. And it's interesting because they span from a friend being like, my student's preschool is trying to use this platform. Is this a good platform? Do you think we should be using it? To PE investors asking me about distressed assets in the education space, to VCs asking about new investment opportunities that were popping up because of the climate. And then, I obviously had spent a lot of time working with educators over at Kaplan, and they had a myriad of questions as well in terms of, what is going to be the future of education. So this is fun for me because up until very recently, being an EdTech entrepreneur was kind of like the stepsister of the cool startup world. And now that we have an addressable market of everyone, since all education is now online, we are suddenly at the hot seat, which is really cool. So when you go into a VC meeting, they're like, what's the TAM? I can confidently say all students on the world.
Everywhere.
Everywhere. So, I mean, this is EdTech's moment, which is really exciting. And I can say there have been some really awesome examples of platforms that have risen to the occasion and really served students. And then there's a lot of stuff that still needs to be figured out. The reason I thought it would be interesting for us to do an Ask Me Anything with this group is because I've worked in EdTech for a long time. I'm a daughter of a public school teacher, so I hear from my mom every night about what it looks like on the ground in the classroom. And then at Kaplan, as an entrepreneur in residence, we had a really interesting moment when COVID first hit, which was we had to turn our entire company, which was largely an in-person instruction company, into an online one. And I can say they confidently did that within 48 hours notice, really beautifully. But through that, really got a front seat to some of the difficulties that come with that. And now, we'll talk a little bit about this, but I'm in the process of launching a new product line that's going to come out this fall because the climate for this fall is going to be completely different for students. And so there's opportunities for new things to grow in that space. And then on top of that, I've spent probably the last 2 months deep in consumer insights and doing more surveys than I think any one human should do in a day. So I just have a lot of data that might be
That's amazing. I'm a big believer. One of my favorite quotes is a Paul Graham line in one of his essays about, how do you find startup ideas? How do you think of the future? And what he counsels, what he says is live in the future and then just look around and notice things that are happening, problems, challenges. And I try to live that. And I think you just shared the way that you're living in the future. And I think it's amazing to, so yeah, I think we'll just ask, what are you seeing? What, if you look around and what's happening in education? So that's going to be amazing. So here, I'll kick it off. There's a lot of these questions, a lot of folks had, there's a lot of overlaps. A lot of folks had very similar interests and questions, but I'll kick it off with maybe a broader one. And here's how I'll say it. So parallel to all of us in the working world, figuring out, can I work from home? How is this going to work? You've already mentioned it. Every student is doing that. They're living this mass experiment. Will work from home work? Can they learn? How much do they need physical schools? So from where you sit, what are some of the biggest things that you're noticing that we're learning in this massive working from or learning from home experiment?
Yeah, so I too am working from home for the first time, and I would definitely call it an experiment. In terms of students learning from home for the first time, we're seeing, probably the biggest challenge that needs to be addressed first and foremost is access. So what I mean by that is that not all students are set up to learn from home. Access to broadband, access to devices is the number one issue that all school districts had to address as step one. And that came with quite a bit of a delay. So when we think about the divide between students who have internet at home, have a device that their parents aren't actively working on, have the space that they can learn, in a way that it's not disrupting their parents' work as well. That's definitely not the situation for most students. And so school districts had to figure out how to get Chromebooks and or other devices into the homes of students. Broadband providers had to figure out how to get different hotspots distributed, and to distribute during a time like this when we're supposed to be social distancing, it was extremely difficult. So access first came in the form of like raw internet and actual devices that you could learn at home from. And then access then started to look at, in the second layer, it's like what schools had platforms up and running that were prepared to interact with their students digitally. And there was huge divides in terms of the way that states and school districts were prepared for this. Fun fact, school districts that had snow day plans in place, contingency plans if they had a snow day, were actually the most prepared for COVID, whereas school districts elsewhere had not. And if you weren't already on an information learning management system with really great directories in which you had all parent contact information, student contact information, and students had been socialized to working through that, it took it as many as 3 weeks for different school districts to see actual attendance rates starts to increase. And actually a report came out this morning from Ed Week, which showed that we're still seeing 25% of students nationwide in the US haven't even engaged with any of their online work, which means they haven't been reachable by teachers or superintendents or principals, and they haven't logged into these platforms. So first and foremost, access is the problem and the topic of conversation for every EdTech entrepreneur.
What are some of the, are there any silver linings, if you will? Like, what are people sort of beginning to see that, this is a good behavior. This is something that I can lean into?
This is something that I saw in some of the questions that started to come through, is that actually the attention span of students are starting to be addressed with the ways in which they're getting delivered this content online. So I don't know about you guys, but a big problem I'm having with working from home is that it's really easy to get distracted by your email or Slack or your phone. Students have that same issue as well. They also have, the need to process information in digestible units in the classroom, and that translates the same to home. And so I think a lot of the work that we're seeing teachers now facilitate with students are in smaller bite-sized pieces. The 7-minute rule that we saw really start to grow throughout different platforms like Coursera and MOOCs, et cetera, is now being applied to in-classroom learning. And that's great because students can have a little bit more agency to self-direct themselves through that experience. Other silver linings is I think that parents are getting involved in their child's education in a way that we haven't necessarily seen before, and quite simply out of necessity. At Clark, which we were a platform for tutors, and when we interviewed tutors in the beginning, when we were building out our different suite of services, we said, what is one thing that we can't solve for you right now through technology? And they said parent engagement, because the number one indicator for how a student would progress from falling behind to getting back to grade level was making sure that parents were reinforcing the same message that a tutor or teacher was as well. And so I think we're going to see a lot of, what's capable in the classroom demystified, and parents taking a much more active role in terms of the way that their kids are delivered information.
That's fascinating. And there was a question about how parents, maybe not necessarily how they'll lean in, but how will they have sustainable work teaching lives now that every parent, is playing double duty?
Yeah.
How can that be sustainable? What is that, like, that situation? How do you see that playing out vis-a-vis this idea of like parent engagement?
Right. Well, I think that the state that we're in right now, it's definitely not sustainable. And I feel so much for all parents who are trying to work at home and then homeschool their children at home as well. I would say in the last 2 months, I've probably met a couple dozen kids on different Zoom calls, and I'm sure you guys all have as well. One of the things that is the leading interrupter of a meeting is a child asking, how do I get to the next step? Or now what do I do? And so I think that what we're going to end up seeing in terms of the ways that we can sustainably keep kids engaged with their device for long periods of time, either doing synchronous or asynchronous instruction from their educator, it's just making sure that transition moments are really clear. We talk about this a lot in the tech industry, right? That like you need retention and nurture streams, because otherwise users are going to start to drop off at certain points. They won't know what to do next. We essentially need nurture streams for each one of the user journeys that a child goes through in a day of education. The issue is that's a really tall order to ask a teacher to do, to think about like, okay, once you've delivered your live lesson that you recorded last night or just, gave live on the Zoom call, now making sure that they have completely figured out what to do next and that they can do it sustainably at home. I mean, that's an opportunity for software to get involved and for email and different types of triggers, whether it be SMS or other push notifications to get you in a good place. The other thing that's going to start to develop a lot more is cohort-based learning, and that I'm so positive of. Kids are going to, in the same way that we've seen them study for tests, they set up their second device on their computer and they're watching all their all their friends hang out. Like, I don't know how many of you have joined house parties since this has happened, but house party is not a great device that we could be using for kids who are trying to do learning together as well. So, kind of the homeschooling trends of cohort-based living, or cohort-based learning rather, and what you've started to see the boot camps adopt too in terms of cohort-based learning, I think will get adopted in K through 12 classrooms too.
Take that, or related, I don't want to like put an answer in your mouth, but the idea of this sort of like asynchronous at-home learning, it removes any of that human interaction, even if it's house party enabled, right? So if this like shift is real, how will the schools teach the sort of emotional, social aspects of student growth? This was an audience question. It's one that we were really interested. A couple folks asked, is there a danger to all the screen-based mediation in terms of learning?
Yeah, and I think this is probably at the top of everybody's mind in terms of when we're thinking about the future. Like, the computer can teach you so much, right? But at the end of the day, learning how to interact with other humans is extraordinarily important. And being able to grow your social and emotional learning throughout that process is, why we send our kids to in-person school, right? And so I think what we're going to have to see is it become part of the core curriculum. There's some really great programs and content and curriculum partners out there, like Move This World is probably one of my favorites. And right now it is discretionary, right? A school has to opt in to having that curriculum implemented into their school district. And so that's something, the school looks at a budget that they could have, bought new devices. They could have brought in a new extracurricular activity, or they can teach us curriculum. I think we're going to find that it's going to become one of the core subjects, and that all the people who are teaching social and emotional learning through different, startups, I think have done a great job in this space. They're going to end up becoming like full subject providers. It obviously will be taught digitally, but I think it'll be given more of a focal point than it was before.
Yeah. I was just on the phone with somebody who is running peer-to-peer mentoring in the workspace. And it feels like, there's very much a focus on the softer side of things, right? You can work, you can learn, but how do you kind of grow as people? I think that's a big area too.
Yeah, it was a trend that we were already seeing universities start to adopt. Universities were starting to realize that it was their responsibility to also address the life stage that students were going through by teaching financial literacy, basically how to be adult 101 with some of the newer curriculum we were seeing starting to be developed for higher ed. And I think that curriculum basically is going to be implemented at all levels.
Yeah. Yeah. So if you had to ballpark it,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, maybe this is a softball, but then let's dig into it. Do you think there's a bigger place for online learning? Do you think we're going to find a status quo that's more online mediated?
Yeah. So, I really think the cool thing that's going to happen as a result of us all learning online is that it's going to be much more personalized and it's going to be much more self-paced. So that's exciting because I think it gives students the space to understand what their core skills are and for them to map their skills against the different tasks at hand. Meaning you're going to get a different school assignment and understand from this, I'm going to get creative writing skills. From this, I'm going to get the ability to problem solve. From this, I'm going to learn a level of CSS, and that's going to be able to unlock this next step.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, the cool thing that technology can do for kids in this instance is help them tag what skills are they getting from what lessons, and then how do those skills map to different journeys. By collecting these skills from these different, lessons that I've done online, what can I do with that? Where can I go? How does one skill beget the next skill? And how does skills eventually equal careers? How do skills eventually equal, my future path? And so I think that claiming that you have a skill will become more important than the grade that you got in a class or the score you got on a test.
That's amazing. Do you see, how do you see test taking evolve? Like at Kaplan, that must be a topic du jour.
Yeah.
But yeah, what are you noticing on that side of life?
I gotta say, I think what is having the most radical shift and will have the most radical shift for the 2020-2021 school year is going to be higher ed, right? Families don't know whether or not their students are going on campus. When you think about the framing of your high school experience, like you probably spent the whole time thinking about how do I get a good SAT score? How do I get good grades so I can get into a good college? And you really had always, how do I get into a good college as the end in sight? Instead of, which is the most appropriate thing to think about, how do I get to a good career path? And how does college unlock that opportunity for me? We basically thought of getting into college as the end all. Like once you're in, then it'll all just be figured out for you. And that I think that's shifting now. People are now looking at college and really critically and saying, are you actually going to unlock my future? Am I going to get the skills I need from going here? And why people are having that internal monologue with themselves, test taking, will definitely dip in terms of its importance. And I think that the cool thing about what a lot of standardized tests have done is they've been quickly able to shift to an online model. I think we've seen them adapt fast. Which is great. It shows that they're prepared for change in a way that I don't think maybe everyone was necessarily assuming that they would be. But I think the importance of a test score will change. And I think we're going to start looking for other markers of how to qualify a student's acceptance.
Yeah. What that makes me think of, going back to a question or an answer you just had of, there's going to be much more atomized and tailored and personalized learning. Why aren't there atomized, tailored, and personalized tests to a degree that it's not standardized anymore, but it's meaningful to say this person is able to do this next thing instead of one big blanket SAT or ACT that literally says you're ready for what's next. It's leaning into this new world of many options, perhaps.
Right. And I mean, to answer your question of like why we don't do that, I think because it's not mandated by the employer. And so if it comes from the end state, which is the entry level job, which is your step after education, most likely, if they're trying to map for not hiring a certain GPA, not trying to hire for a certain, college degree, but they're instead mapping for a collection of skills, credentials, et cetera, that's, from the top down, it will change.
Yeah. I was thinking a lot about just business school as like not a pinnacle, but like a higher form of higher ed, and how, if you look in the headlines, there's students from top tier schools asking for refunds and no one thinks they're going to go back. And so how do those folks have to evolve, have to evolve sort of like at that linchpin? And this is almost maybe bordering into like continuing ed, right? Like career advancement and things and such. You mentioned like the employer is going to have to kind of lean in and want these things, but how do you get past the credential? Like, what do you think
Yeah.
that looks like from the educator side?
It's a great question. And I think that, so the reason that so many students are asking for refunds is because we as a society have basically said that online education has a lower value than in-person education. And the reason that we say that online education is a lower value is because there's been less data to show that we have the same cognitive outcomes, that students will have the same progression. I think we're going to get a lot better at testing. Did kids learn the stuff the same way that they did in person versus out? And then, we charge less in the consumer groups for online education because we assume there's less personalization, right? The student can't walk up to the teacher at the end of class and say, I have this question, it's only related to me, can you help just me? So I think the way that we kind of can start to get around people valuing the online world is for, different providers to think through, how do we do personalization? How do we give a best-in-class learning experience? If you look at the company Outlier, that was basically their whole mandate. They, started their organization all around the idea of like, how do we have like the best cinematography, the best experience for students, so that way they're fully captivated and engaged, and in doing so, they will learn the content. To answer your question around like, how do we get away from the credential? I think that, in certain industries we won't, as it relates to becoming a CPA, anything that requires licensure, medical, the credential is still, it was, if anything, kind of an early adopter of what I'm talking about, of like skills equal careers.
Right.
And it's interesting that stopped with things related to legal, medical, finance. We're starting to see it integrate into the tech industry. I think if anyone's hired an engineer in the last couple of years, like you've started to see the way that they talk about their different credentials through AWS or what other platforms starting to butt up to show the same level of like, a license then begets a certain type of career. But other than it coming top down, it's, I think, providers of different credentialing software really like sticking their head out there and like having a name for themselves in this space, saying like, okay, you have the, insert the company name, certified, critical thinking certificate. And then it's up to employers or whoever is evaluating that to just think that there's credibility in the person giving out the credential. I think we're very, if I were to make a prediction, I think we're going to see the Wild West in terms of credentialing happening everywhere. We're about to all over badge ourselves, and like that LinkedIn where it says, what are your skills? It's suddenly going to get crowded in a way that it never has. Like, it's one of the sections of LinkedIn you ignored probably up until now. But I think we're going to see a huge boom in that. And then in the same way we saw a huge boom in everyone saying like, this is organic food, eventually there'll be regulation to be like, okay, what are we calling a like actual valid skill versus not?
Right. I can even imagine people competing in new ways to prove the efficacy. Like you mentioned measurements as a key thing that keeps back some of these programs, being able to use digital tools to measure efficacy, to do clever things to show that maybe it's making partnerships with certain employers, whatever it might be, to build some kind of microcosm of credibility. It's almost like credibility is going to get atomized in all these different small ways before it gets reaggregated, perhaps beyond Harvard.
Very well said. And I think that those credentials will end up becoming as powerful as the Harvard diploma.
Yeah. Do you think, so just to like take our journey all the way up in terms of like proper workplace learning, right? The things that, you could ask the same questions we've asked about, like, I haven't seen a human colleague in 6 weeks. My relationships with them are obviously deteriorating. How do I continue to grow as a worker? Maybe I have always been taking Coursera's or Udemy's or whatever it might be, but do you see any shifts happening on that side, whether it's big company or freelancer or anything in between?
Yeah, I think there's been actually, prior to all of this happening, this is probably one of the hottest spaces. I think Guild, what they're doing is phenomenal. Going into companies, helping them benchmark in terms of what does it mean for, certain levels inside your company to have, manager, executive, what have you status. What are the skills that they need to have? How can we help nurture individuals through those experiences, what have you? And I think that, great work has been done in that space. I would say to your question, honestly, like if you wanted to think, how can I continue to learn as an employee, is to go to your employer and say, like, I think that we need to have a company-wide solution happening, because they have to benchmark, for you, what does success look like at each one of those steps? To go back to your credibility question, your employer has to care that you have that skill, and they have to be able to say you have the level of proficiency that they need to say that you can move to the next step. So I really do believe that still online employer corporate education solutions are going to be the way forward. If you're thinking about how do I navigate, from one space to another, how do I elect into other types of education outside of, what is available to me, I think it's going to become difficult, because not only was this a crowded space in terms of things you could learn online, the number of marketplaces, the number of free solutions out there.
Yeah.
And so what I think is going to end up happening is we're going to start to see curators pop up online, who are essentially, I hate to use this word, but influencers. And I think these influencers will essentially help people understand, of all of the content that's out here, like, here's the quality stuff that you need to take a look at. And in order to get to this job, or get to this status, or get to this understanding of a topic, here's the, unique pieces that you should put together to get there. Because I will say choice paralysis is real, and the amount of online education available to us right now, globally, is just astronomical. I do not think there is an opportunity in creating new content. I think there is an opportunity in aggregating content into like effective coursework and effective solutions, and then making sure that like your recommendations are easy for people to follow.
Yeah, I get that. I feel anyone who's ever gone on these platforms feels the analysis paralysis of what to choose, and then the sort of uncertainty of where this gets me, because it's not, there's no clearly trodden paths. That idea of influencers makes me think that for me, an influencer might be Google. It might be what a corporate, this is coming back to the employer saying, I care about this, if you will. How do you think about this idea of like influencer-led content playing out for the younger folks, right? They are completely influencer driven. Is this a way to drive engagements? Should there be a new learning platform that is TikTok meets Udemy? Like, should we be building that today?
I mean, it's not a bad idea. You heard it here first. I mean, you saw on YouTube already, for kids who are in the K through 12 space, influencers on YouTube. So educators that can make somewhat dry content super engaging, and it includes animation and illustration and acting and the whole 9 yards.
Right.
The thing is, when you're in a newscaster style, right? Like when you're just delivering information outward, it doesn't feel personalized. And so, as I said earlier, the real thing that's going to be needed for students to succeed in their learning at home is going to be personalization. And so I think what's going to happen is we're going to see these kind of like celebrity educators continue to grow. And then I think what we're going to end up seeing is that real world educators are going to be leveraging that content as like in classroom videos, like they used to, put in something that was a little bit more dry into the VCR. Yeah. In terms of TikTok meets Udemy, again, I don't think there should be any more content really
right.
developed. But I do think that, it is the responsibility of major players who are doing the vast majority of entry-level hiring in America and now, globally rather, to say like, this is what we certify as like an entity where you can learn the information you need to work here. And here's, we give it our stamp of approval.
How do you, this thought just came to me, so I'll just run with it. How do you square the idea that there's already too much content out there with the rise of, call it the passion economy, and the ability for me to, or you and I to create some content right now, or for me to pull a course together on the thing I did last week and maybe get it out to 10 people. I can sort of see that world where you get these like super micro credentials, which is like, I apprenticed underneath Megan O'Connor and she taught me everything she knows about entrepreneurship. I would go for that. But how do you, like, is there some middle ground? What do you think about that?
It's an interesting point. And I think there is a difference between learning things online, like going on jump rope, for example, and being like, great, now I can cook this thing or make this thing, or, you know, there's differences between what we call like maker education, where I want to learn how to create something and I'm going to learn it from the creator. That I believe still has a vast world ahead of us.
Okay.
And I think that like we've seen engagement on that platform skyrocket. I mean, if somebody like me who has never cooked before is now watching a video to learn how to cook, like we know that that world has arrived. It's happening. In terms of that type of environment applying to, you know, traditional coursework, I think that, you know, it's like I said earlier, I think they're going to have a really tricky road ahead because there's already a really saturated market for that type of content. But, you know, the thing that you brought up, which I think is interesting, is that like we as humans are now kind of always going to be in a state of learning, because we're going to be, if you're a student going to school all day, and then now this is what we do with our free time, right? If we're not watching Netflix, we're not going outside, you're taking a master class, you're taking some other type of, let's learn how to do something new. And so that'll be interesting to see how that plays out if we end up, you know, using the majority of our free time to be a learner.
Yeah. Between, just because you mentioned two different very interesting companies in that last answer there, Jump Rope and Masterclass, maybe don't pick the winners, but which form factors do you think are most interesting for you? Or maybe pick winners, go for it.
Gosh, it's a good question. What are some, you know, I will say that there's been some really interesting proprietary software built in the fitness space that I think is going to start to be applied to the education space.
That's cool.
So that's going to be an interesting mashup that's going to come soon. In terms of, you know, information learning management systems, I think Canvas, who already was starting to get a lot of market share, like that's growing pretty rapidly as well. I don't think anyone thought that Zoom was an education platform until very recently. And once they get their privacy issues figured out, I think they are going to end up becoming the largest education provider in the world. And like, who saw that coming? And so I think that, you know, not to name a couple of winners here, but I do think that you'll see those develop pretty quickly. The interesting thing is, you know, there's a lot of free solutions out there like Quizlet that I'm a huge fan of as well, that are like quiz-based, quick hit-based education for students. Like those were already popular. They will continue to grow as well. But I think that in terms of which platforms will win across each of the different categories I just talked about, they're going to have to be ones that really do a great job of onboarding. You know, in the tech industry, we always say like your product is as strong as your onboarding flow. And I really do believe that. Like we are going to see so many people having to be intrinsically motivated to learn certain things, onboarding themselves onto software solutions that they've never used before, and not be in classroom with a teacher who can help socialize them to that new platform. So overarchingly, the products that win here are the ones that can educate new users seamlessly.
Yes. And there's a whole crop of digitally native folks who will take to the good things like water and they'll pick the winners without even trying, which is fascinating to think about. Sort of a bottoms up economy coming out of this. I remember in one of our builds comparing go-to-market to schools, thinking about how Google Classroom went straight to the teachers, right? And just said, this is a better solution for the teachers. And they forced the schools to get on board at some points.
And that's the way that a lot of teachers started to involve different types of cool tech products into their classroom education, was their kids were already using it, right?
Yeah.
So the bottom-up approach. And so you have to, I think as a product right now, think about how could a student of any age learn how to use this by themselves without teacher or parent intervention? And then that's where you grow from there.
Yeah. What do you see just in sort of the like moment we're living in with massive disruption, perhaps a recession coming down the pipeline? What do you see sort of being the like macroeconomic impacts related to education? Are there going to be more people going back to school? Are they going to stick with Udemy and do that? Like, where do you see the sort of trend in the next 3, 6, 9 months playing out?
So a trend that's already hit that you've seen all the major education players do is kind of like a holistic, like reboot your career product. So everything from let's get your resume into a good place, let's work on interview questions, let's look at positioning yourself. I think that those are products that are jumping out a lot. Most of them are free. Most of them have follow-on coaching, like, beyond the paywall options.
Yep.
I think that that is going to be something that we'll continue to see. I think that you're going to see a lot of people who were furloughed or laid off at a later stage of life go and take online courses in different, free or low or inexpensive platforms, not necessarily to get the skill, but to show a prospective employer, like, I know how to still learn new things.
Interesting.
And so
Yeah.
that way, even if you aren't coming
Wow.
with the, prerequisite for a certain job, or you didn't do it right before, you can be like, I'm still an adaptive learner. And so I am
Fascinating. Yeah.
doing this.
This is a thought that's coming to me. I don't know if it's going to hold water, but we've never seen a cliff like we just had in terms of unemployment and people coming off.
Mm-hmm.
And before 4 weeks ago, if anyone was talking about sort of like the massive reskilling of America, it was in the conversation of automation. And what's going to happen when Uber figures this out and truck drivers are in the state or whatnot. That was definitely an intellectual conversation in the last few years.
Mm-hmm.
But now we almost have that scenario. We have
Right.
a version of that.
Right.
And I'm now so curious to go back to all the tweets and see what people were saying is the answer,
I
because
know.
it's about to happen. We're going to have to figure out how to help people find their next thing and get beyond what they were doing before, right? Beyond their resume, beyond their location, perhaps.
And I don't have a strong prediction around this. I'm just more curious about it. But like, already such a massive amount of the economy was a gig economy employee, right? I think it was like over 70% of professionals were considered independent contractors.
Wow.
And so now with us adding the furlough numbers on top of that, like, people who work at salaried jobs within companies, that is going to be the minority and the anomaly. So there is most likely, now I'm kind of talking myself into a prediction. The things I just said in terms of, companies have the responsibility to educate their different employees through credentialing steps along the way. Like, there maybe is an opportunity for a provider to pick up the gig economy effectively, and provide them that same level of corporate education, because that's where the TAM is now.
Yeah. I was going to ask, do you see any sort of companies coming out of left fields that might have opportunities in this new world? Whether that's the Ubers educating various folks, or I don't know, is Amazon hiring hundreds and hundreds of thousands of new workers, maybe for a short period of time? I don't know. Those are two that come to mind. But what do you think in terms of some of the bigger players, how they're going to react, how that might play out?
Yeah, I think that, well, you've seen on the marketplaces, there's been a huge uptick in terms of like need for people who can provide education to students in tutoring and, school, and all different things related to education marketplaces. So I think that the first week, I think there was, an endless amount of calls of like, we need more people on the platform. So that was the first uptick. I think that the more macro trend that we're going to start to see is that companies are very likely going to start creating their own universities, and they are going to start thinking about, how can we be a vocational school? How can we usher people into working for us? Because then they can modulate open roles with graduates like pretty seamlessly. And that's where we will see less, graduates who then go into what is, like we saw in 2008, just basically a vast sea of no job opportunities. I think that we'll see getting into those corporate sponsored universities as a much more like sure bet that you're going to see a guaranteed level of employment for a certain amount of time. Anything else that came out of left field during this time? The interesting thing is, like I said at the beginning of this, is just how many students weren't reachable. And that has been such a huge effort of public schools. Like, just to give, a personal story, my mom is a middle school teacher, and in the first week they went to online education, she saw, just about 50% of her students show up. Then, because of quite simply the fact that not all parents had been reached either through email or their students through email, which had to be communicated through their school-related email address, my mom had to call all of the families. Then she started to see closer to 2/3 of the students showing up. But there's still a gap. And like that report I said mentioned, 25% of students nationally are just not engaging whatsoever. So if I were to say what's next, it's going to be something coming out of left field that is access provider.
Awesome. I mean, this was an audience question, and you pretty much teed it up, which is how can we use this moment to redesign our approach to public ed? Like, are there bigger shifts? It's almost the answer to that question you just asked, right? Which is, it's also a little bit of what, if anyone's following all the tech news, Mark Andreessen basically calling out all of our failed institutions up and down, left and right, all across every country. We're not ready. So how do we use this to fix a few things? Like if you were to get building, Megan, next, what are some of those things, maybe very big picture, that you might think about building? And I see you muted yourself because you had a ambulance going on. If it's passed,
okay,
it's good.
You can't unmute yourself, just everybody. Yes, I'm still in New York City, and so there are still emergencies happening all around. Okay, so if you were to ask the question one other way, I'm trying to think. Yeah, ask the question one more time, and let's
yeah. So how can this moments of disruption help us kind of leaning into the solves for public education, right? If you were the Secretary of Ed, what would you be pushing for nowadays?
Well, I think that, we all are as strong as the environment we're in, right? Like environment matters for so much. And I think everybody can relate to this because now that they're working from home, they're like, oh, the chair I sit in matters. Like the room I sit in matters. Like environment is everything. So just a spitball off of that, like I think that one of the things that going to school did every day for students is it became the great equalizer because all students of all socioeconomic backgrounds were sitting in the exact same classroom. How public school can really show up is realizing that providing a classroom isn't, now that we're not doing that, that really isn't the end all for creating environments of learning for students. And so how do we create environments of learning for students? Like I would say parent engagement is a number one. Like how can we be teaching parents in the same way we're teaching kids about what students need, how you need to be involved, etc. I think that we're going to see like almost like a starter kit to start to go to school happen. Like you used to get the manila envelope with all the different handouts for the year. I think that it's actually going to be a holistic tool set, which I hope comes with all the technology that you need to succeed as well. And I think that we're going to be spending a lot more time educating students on how to learn now that we're not controlling their environment, meaning, telling them the importance of social and emotional learning, telling them the importance of taking breaks, helping them modulate when should you be on versus off. When should you be doing homework? What hours of the day? As adults, we spend so much time thinking about like, how can I be most productive? I think we'll start to do that for students as well. And then for kids who really don't have an at-home space in which learning is conducive, perhaps we start to see WeWorks for education, where it is government sponsored, but it's a safe and reliable space where kids can learn.
That's a fascinating little future in terms of atomizing it, getting it closer to home, in terms of bringing people together for social connection, but not getting everybody together, the 3,000 kids in your town together, but smaller groups, if you will.
More cohorted,
That's fascinating. And I love that. That's a great thought there.
Someone told that next.
So we're getting closer to time, and I have one last doozy of a good question. But if anyone else has any questions or any thoughts that would be an ad, now is the time to throw it in the chat because I'll get to that at any point. But for you, Megan, what advice would you give to a founder of an EdTech company starting up today, tomorrow, given the uncertainties of how things will play out, given the changing in the future, given your experience building a company and now more companies, what would you tell the aspiring entrepreneur?
So to the aspiring entrepreneur in EdTech, I would say already K through 12 sales cycles were really hard and slow. And given how much information overload administrators are under right now to change and adopt, you're probably not going to be able to launch a product into that sales cycle right now. You'll get lost in the noise. So I believe that your come to market strategy definitely has to be parent and student focused, and then end up having the growth journey that we talked about at the beginning of this call. It's like, if teachers really like you, if students really like you, if parents really like you, then it'll come from the bottom up. I think that is probably one of the most important things for an entrepreneur to know right now. I would also say, like, there's going to be a real critical eye on privacy and compliance now more than ever. You know, Zoom ran into a bit of an issue with this when schools started to leverage it. So like, be buttoned up there. Like, if a school feels like they can trust you, if they feel like you have that under control, then like, you're really going to win quite a bit there. And then I would say, you know, some of the stuff that I mentioned in terms of opportunity areas, like, be a curator of content, be an expert. You know, something one of my mentors said to me when this all started, it was like, if the world has completely changed, no one's an expert anymore. So if you can now be an expert of the new world that we live in and be a like expert curator of content around certain subjects or areas, like, that's probably how you'll win. And I would definitely recommend starting to get thought leadership out on those topics as quickly as possible, and then backfill building the product.
Yeah, it's like a brave new world, right?
It really is.
That's a really encouraging thing to say to anyone trying to break in, right? Everyone was making it up as they went. They weren't doing a great job at it, and now it's completely sidelined.
Yeah.
Danielle had a question here. Do you think that during this time, we'll see a reframing of how schools look at technology and adding that to the curriculum? iPads, computers, apps, etc.
Yeah, it's going to be a tiered approach. So the first thing we have to tackle there is educator technical literacy, which like was an issue at the gate, because not to any fault of their own, but not all educators were prepared in terms of understanding software suites and connection and things like that in order to effectively be an online educator. I think the thing that will follow that is that now, okay, we're all up and running in terms of being online, but that doesn't mean we're good at it yet, right? So adopting pedagogy for interactive learning in a virtual setting will be the next step. So how do I take what used to be a lecture hall of hundreds of students and turn it into, you know, the Partridge Family, like little squares, and make it actually interactive and interesting to students? I think you'll see cinematography start to play a bigger role. I think you'll see the companies that have invested in like quality video start to win. And then, you know, to answer your question, like, will there be a reframe of the way that we use these things? Yes. Kids are going to start to get probably what you're all feeling right now, screen fatigue. So we're going to have to figure out not only how to like thoughtfully interact with our computers, iPads, tablets, etc. We're also going to have to figure out how can we have kids do things away from devices, do them handwritten, do them with pens and pencils, and then how can we still sync that up without, you know, any disconnect to the online experience that they're having.
Do you think, Madeline asked, do you think there's an AR VR element to this? Because you just brought us back to pencils and paper, but does it swing all the way to the new future?
Yeah, I mean, there definitely is. I bring it back to access. Like, there's an opportunity for sure here, but we've got to be making sure, like, schools won't implement it unless we're going to be seeing it available to everyone. And that will be, you know, we'll end up controlling for the lowest access denominator. So we'll start to see that happen in, I think, super high affluent families. But I mean, there's definitely a play here. Again, how do we get devices in more kids' hands?
Yeah. But also the fatigue, that's always been, at least VR's major downfall.
Yeah, I've been preparing for this moment this whole time. I didn't realize it.
So this is good. Questions are flowing in. We have a few minutes left here. So John asks, when students do come back to the classroom, whether all at once or in stages, how do you see the physical layout of the classroom changing, if at all?
It's an interesting question. How do I see the physical layout changing? You know, classrooms are typically positioned for collaboration, right? So, because there's always that now do group work, now talk with your group. So you'll see pod seating being the vast majority of K through 12 style classrooms. And then in universities, you see lecture halls where everybody is independently watching this dynamic lecturer. How I think the layout will change, I mean, we'll have more space between people, unfortunately. So I'm like, group work is going to take a new form, that's for sure.
Yeah.
And I think that what we'll probably end up seeing is like people at home will have become so accustomed to a certain way that they work and interact. We'll probably see a lot more screens pop up that can just showcase that in bigger ways. So instead of us all just looking at our individual devices, we're maybe looking at a collective device so we can still have more of a shared experience.
Yeah, or technology permeating between yourself, the shared experience,
Yeah.
somehow you're there. I
Yeah,
mean, I
like
don't think,
a board or something like that.
yeah, we also haven't figured out what that new norm is in terms of going back to the office and how socially distanced will be while we're whiteboarding with each other. Do we kind of get over some hump there? That's going to be a thing.
Yeah.
Madeline's asking, how does mental health play into the future of EdTech? Nice and broad. What do you think?
I mean, it's a good question. How does mental health play into it? So the thing is, we can, and I'm sure everyone has felt this in their own work, like if you're feeling weird about what's going on in the world right now, you're not as productive. So it's kind of like there is no teaching unless people are feeling in a good space with their mental health. So I think it will become a much more universal conversation. I think it won't be like, okay, now, I'm going to deal with these personal feelings and I'm going to do it in a way in which I feel hidden or I feel ashamed or it's a private experience. I think mental health will become a shared experience and something that people don't feel weird about talking about.
That's amazing. And the Gen Z already does that. They have no shame about what their therapist told them. And it's great. It's amazing because that's, I think, how the rest of us should be feeling.
I agree with you.
Yeah. Go Gen Z. Naveen's asking, how do we calculate the value of an expensive 4-year degree with such uncertain employment numbers?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question because some people are going to be graduating right now and not able to get the same job that they could have just months ago. So, I mean, in the same way that stocks are volatile, like owning a certain level of a company meant something one day and then didn't another, like we're going to see that exact same thing happen to degrees. Like the market will dictate how valuable these degrees are 100%. And then it's going to be how well you can instead equate your degree to skills that match the open jobs in the market. And like I said, my prediction is that company-sponsored universities are going to be the fastest way to do that.
There seems to be, I mean, just logically, there's this lag. So if you join school today, you could probably be confident 3 years, 4 years from now, life is good. You had no sense that the bottom was going to fall out 4 years ago when you started. I imagine everyone in that same boat today is almost a prime customer for something, whether it's to reskill or to get entrepreneurial or something different than the job that doesn't exist anymore.
Right.
Which is fascinating.
Totally.
So we are definitely close to time, and it seems we've gotten to the end of the questions. So what if we call it here and give everyone back 5 minutes?
Perfect.
Megan, thanks so much for joining and riffing and answering some great questions. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you.
I hope everyone enjoyed it. Yeah, I'm Andrew from Human Ventures. This is Megan from Clark, Kaplan, and all sorts of cool places. And we really thank you for joining us and appreciate all your input.
Yeah. Thank you guys.
Thanks, everyone.